Good evening, folks. We're happy to have you join us again for another session with Dr. Adria Truckenmiller and the Reading League Michigan. Dr. Truckenmiller is currently working on a grant-funded research project through the IES, an IES practice grant related to the implementation of a writing program in schools, if I'm saying that correctly, Adria? I got that correct?
You got it.
All right, and we are really so proud to have her at Michigan State University, Michigan's very own. So with that, we thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Truckenmiller.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks to everybody for joining us. I am super excited to talk with you more today in our journey of looking through the different aspects of the direct and indirect effects model of writing. And we're working our way through each of the components here in September. We started with this top level, looking at the socio-emotional components and the discourse level knowledge that contribute to what we observe in students' written composition. And then in October, we talked about the some of the executive functions, some of the cognitive abilities, which are the 3 specific executive functions, including working memory, shifting, and inhibitory control. We talked about those in October and how they situate all of the other skills that are involved with writing. Today, we're going to take a look at some other cognitive abilities. We're going to look at inference making, perspective taking, and monitoring, and how those act as mediators for oral language, or vocabulary and syntax, to then translate into how students, we as adults, create in composition. Then finally in 2022, we'll get to my 2 actual favorite topics, which are the vocabulary and syntax, and then the lexical and transcription skills. We'll talk about those then. So today, let's dive right in. Our agenda, we'll go through talking about what are inferencing, this theory of perspective taking, and monitoring. And because these are the mediators in this model, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what mediation is and what that means in this model. We'll talk about some instructional pieces. We'll then talk about this is similar and integrated with reading. And then I wanted to jump into, if we have time, looking at some exciting research directions in this particular area. So let's first talk about what are we talking about when we look at inferencing? I think the best way to understand it is with an example. So inferencing is when we make connections that aren't explicitly there in the text. Here's an example of a situation. Before Jim left for work, he put on a heavy coat. What was the weather like? And so using our inferencing abilities, we understand that when you put on a heavy coat, that means it's cold outside. So that is something that's cognitively occurring in our brains, making connections without us maybe even being consciously aware of it. The next component is theory of mind, or I will refer to this simultaneously as perspective taking. And I think perspective taking is a little bit more of a descriptive term. But what this means, you're able to see the world from somebody else's eyes. And so an example of this would be listening to a short scenario about a character and asking somebody to point out what mistaken belief that a character might have about another character's knowledge. The last one that we'll talk about this evening is monitoring. And the way you can see this is listening to a short story and making sure it makes sense, and then picking out the pieces that don't make sense and repairing it. And if we're able to do this, that means we're monitoring our comprehension of what's happening in a story. So these are the three components. And this is how they were measured in Young-Suk Kim's model, the direct and indirect effects of writing model. So that's what is specifically being referred to in this model. And you can see that this is a domain general. These are domain general cognitive abilities, meaning that we use these, of course, in reading. I'm sure most of you recognize that we use these in reading. We also use these in our interactions and other aspects of life, social skills. And they also have an impact in writing, and it's not a domain specific impact in writing, but we can look at how this also influences writing. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what we mean by inferencing. I really think it's a challenge to succinctly understand what inferencing is. Colby Hall in 2016 wrote a really nice quote that I think explains it pretty well. The pretty intense construct, she explains it really well. So she said, reading with comprehension involves constructing a coherent representation or situation model of text within our memory. RAP describes a situation model as a network with nodes that depict individual facts and events and connections that depict meaningful relations between them. Coherence reflects the degree to which appropriate, meaningful connections are established between information in the text and between information in the text and the reader's prior knowledge. These connections are known as inferences. So I'm going to take a real short dive into cognitive psychology theory, and I'm wondering, we're going to try to use some of these Zoom functions here. If you can pop in and indicate yes or no, there is like a yes or no symbol, or you can just write yes or no in the chat. How many of you have taken a cognitive psychology course? Has anybody get an idea of how many people are familiar with cognitive psychology? Oh, good. Rebecca found the yes symbol in there, and so did Julie. And we got one no. All right. Two no's. Mixed bag. Because yeah, it's usually hit or miss if people have been able to take cognitive psychology or not. So a lot of this comes from the cognitive psychology background. And a lot of reading comprehension comes from this perspective as well. So I just wanted to make you very aware that when we're talking about these constructs tonight, that I'm not pulling in any other perspectives. It's kind of narrowly focused in that background, mostly because we have a lot of good empirical work supporting that particular one, but it's also not the only perspective that's out there. There's a lot of things that we can learn from sociocultural theories as well that influences how comprehension works. But tonight we're going to take a cognitive perspective. So as you can see from this definition here, this is describing a mental situation model that if you picture inside your brain, there's these little facts, pieces of information, and our brain is reorganizing them and sending activation to different nodes when certain pieces of information light up, in quotes. So that's my situation model of how situation models work. And what this might look like in thinking about a concept, let's say you're either reading or writing about how the heart circulation works. And you're learning different facts about heart circulation. And as you're reading or as you're writing about it, you're making types of connections between different ideas. And so here's just one of Walter Kinch is one of the people who's well known for the situation model. Other people who have done a lot of great work with this are Keith Rayner and Chuck Perfetti also do a lot around this. And so you can see how the different ideas are hierarchically ordered or related to one or more different ideas. And so the cognitive psychology behind this is that we make these connections. Humans are very good at making connections. It's an evolutionary adaptation that we're pretty good at making these connections. And they might conceptually look like all of these little nodes of facts that are connected to each other. So that's inferencing. We're either explicitly making those connections from the text and when we're writing the text, or we're implicitly creating these connections. And the more we do this, the better our comprehension is. The more we do this in our writing, the easier it is for other people to understand when they're reading. So it's definitely a key piece of both reading and writing. Okay, so that's inferencing in a nutshell. I'm going to move on to mediation and try to describe as well as I can this construct of mediation. So in Kim's model, we have inferencing, perspective taking, and monitoring as mediating the influence of vocabulary and syntax on discourse level knowledge, which then predicts how students do in their written composition. Furthermore, in her model, she's shown empirically that working memory, inhibitory control, shifting, these executive functions are mediated by vocabulary and syntax. So it creates this cascading path of mediation. So what the heck am I talking about with mediation? So mediation is identifying the process by which something happens. So it's either a process or a mechanism are the terms that are most comprehensible for me to use in thinking about what mediation is doing. And sometimes or often it's an unobservable mechanism. So let's take an example outside of writing to try to demonstrate what mediation is. And so let's think about an outcome of work performance. And we think about high or low work performance during the day. Many of us may be familiar with if we have poor sleep, poor quality sleep, or really great sleep the night before, that can influence our work performance. And so we know that our sleep quality affects work performance. But we wonder, what is the process or mechanism by which our sleep quality is affecting our work performance? And that's a mediator. So research has found that your level of alertness is the process by which your sleep quality then determines how alert you are during the day. And then that level of alertness is what really predicts your work performance. So may not be as much of a direct effect between sleep quality and work performance, because maybe at the beginning of the day, when we first get there, even though we had poor sleep quality, we might still be pretty alert and so still have pretty good work performance. But that sleep quality is going to eventually affect that alertness. So that's the mediator is alertness. A lot of times mediating processes get confused with some other similar processes called moderators. So for example, a moderator of this relationship between sleep quality and work performance might be distractions. And distractions are not the process by which sleep quality affects work performance. We might still be able to do our work despite distractions. But what distractions do is it changes the strength of the relationship. So it's probably more likely that our work performance will be poor when we have poor sleep quality and a lot of distractions. So that's the differentiation there between a mediating relationship and a moderating relationship. The reason we want to find out about these mediating variables and find out about that mediating relationship is because we know we can intervene with either that mediator and or intervene with the independent variable that we're looking at, independent variable being sleep quality. So for alertness, right, we could have caffeine, drink some coffee. For sleep quality, we might try to go to bed earlier, something like that. I see that my internet is unstable. Am I coming through okay? Yep, okay, good. Right. And so to get all of those words, our words sentences put together.
We are losing you, Adria.
So yeah, let's try to apply this mediation concept to writing. And so when we're looking at the discourse, we know that our whole essay is composed of vocabulary words, the words that we're trying to produce, and putting those words into sentences. And those sentences get put together into the discourse. But there's things that are mediating that ability of us to put those words and sentences together. And those things that Kim found in her model are those three constructs that we just talked about: the inferencing, the perspective taking, and our monitoring of those inferences. And if we're able to take another's perspective while we're writing, we might be able to see where we're not making enough connections in our writing for them to be able to for our readers to have that inference. Also, we know this other mediating variable that's vocabulary and syntax is mediating our working memory abilities, which then impacts inferencing, perspective taking, and monitoring as well. So if our word finding abilities are taking up too much of our working memory, we're not going to be as quick with coming up with better words. And our better words, then we're not going to be able to do a whole lot of good inference making if we can't come up with the right vocabulary words or the right sentences to put together. So again, as we talked about in the previous slide, that both the mediator and the independent variables can be intervened with. We know we have some good vocabulary interventions and syntax interventions that we'll talk about next month. But also there may be a few things that we can do at the mediation level in trying to help with inferencing, perspective taking, and monitoring. What I wanted to do is take a minute and see if you can identify in a kind of a low inference student's writing, grade 5 students writing, and a high inference, high monitor, students writing. Although I think the first one, the low inference one, also has some high monitoring too. And I just want to take a minute here, have you read these two. These are the same two writing samples that I showed last month. But I want you to read them and think about the inferencing, the monitoring, the perspective taking that is occurring in both of these two. And after that minute, I would love to have somebody come off mute and point some things out that they see. So what do you see, either in terms of their inferencing, their monitoring, their perspective taking, and or maybe how those things are mediating their vocabulary and syntax use as well?
The whole perspective of the economic positivity of having a camel and that inferencing to the whole value of the camel rather than just the camel itself and the characteristics of the camel. Lucas, or it says, dear Lucas, that piece, that student takes the value of the camel to a whole other level.
Oh, wow. I didn't even see that. That is really cool. Yeah, you're right.
And also in the Dear Lucas one, that student can put themselves in the position of someone who might benefit from having a camel, and the language that they're using, I think that you'd enjoy, and that this could help you, and just a few other words like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first writer also is trying to take the perspective, right? I'm going to tell you my point. I have a point to make, and I'm going to tell you that point. But they don't quite have the sentence structure there to be able to tell you what their point is, but they realize that they need to do that and they want to do that. And so I think that's really interesting how also with some monitoring, they change directions in the middle of the sentence. And so they're really wrestling with this really well. Well, they're wrestling with it and developing those pieces. And we can kind of see how, particularly if you're still trying to come up with the words to write like this, not sure what they're even trying to write here in some of these words. But that's taking up a lot of their processing, of their working memory, and then they're not able to monitor that their sentence doesn't quite make sense and give enough details to the reader them do that. So I think it's really interesting to put a name to what's happening in these things. And I think some of these terms have helped me try to put a name to what's happening in students' text. So what can we do at the instruction level particularly with those mediation variables. And this is where I think the literature, well, the literature is generally pretty thin on writing in general, but the research literature on how to intervene with inference effective monitor, particularly for writing in specific, is harder to find. I'm going to start with inference instruction. Inference instruction, luckily we have a little bit more information about this, given what we've learned from the area of reading. So in reading instruction, I'm pulling from a 2016 literature synthesis by Colby Hall, where she pulled all of the high quality evidence-based intervention practices for inference instruction, specifically for students who struggle with reading. And in this literature synthesis, she found mostly studies that were conducted in the 80s and 90s, and found the things that all of you wonderful teachers I know do in your classroom already, which is activating the prior knowledge, having students predict what they anticipate will occur in the story, given certain pieces of information, helping them identify key clues, facts, and linking words in the text. And the few studies that were in this synthesis did find large effect sizes for these struggling readers. However, we still have a long way to go in understanding how to really, what the specific characteristics of inference instruction, what really works. And her review concluded with, really, there's kind of more questions than actual solid answers of how to do this. So when we're asking students questions, what if they don't get the right answer, right? How do we scaffold them to that place? And is really asking those questions, is that what's the mechanism for their learning? We're not real sure. Plenty of area for future research. Also thinking about perspective taking, particularly, and monitoring. These, I went looking for perspective taking instruction and monitoring instruction, and the only perspective taking instruction interventions that I found were a lot for social skills, and particularly building social skills for students with autism. As we know, perspective taking and theory of mind is one of the big signals in autism. So a lot of that's domain general to social skills types of instruction. And I wasn't able to find anything writing specific to writing instruction that looked at impacts on perspective taking. Although we would probably guess that some of the instruction that we have is can have an impact on perspective taking. I would imagine peer mediated discussion. We have really great effect sizes for any type of intervention that includes discussion with peers. We also have some good data on students writing together, creating a story together. And so you can imagine if you were, for example, going around the room and having one student give you the first sentence of a story that you're writing together, and then have another student give the next sentence, that they would have to be making inferences about what's coming next, monitoring what already happened in order to say what happens next. So we can hypothesize that these kinds of instructional components that we've seen be effective in general probably have an impact on that piece. My other guess for monitoring is that anything that involves rereading, which is rereading what we've already written, monitoring as we're writing a sentence, does this make sense? And then as we put in place different revision strategies, and one of those revision strategies is saying, does this make sense, right? So although we don't have impacts, we haven't measured impacts directly on these mediators, we can hypothesize that some of these things would work in instruction. So at this point, I'm really interested in, because the literature is somewhat shallow and is not as well developed, what you may have noticed in your own instruction that you think would work really well for these mediators. Leslie, I imagine SRSD has a lot of impact on some of these people as well. What would you hypothesize?
Yeah, I'm still reeling from what Rebecca, I think it was, said earlier, that the learning was so much deeper in the second example. And so that's still sort of swimming around in my mind. And I was thinking the perspective in that second example seemed stronger, but then you pointed out that the perspective taking in the first one was also there. And where I'm going with this is the instruction that sets kids up to structure their writing. I don't know if that's really deepening perspective taking, but I think it's making better learning possible, because you both made me realize the perspective taking in both those pieces was good. But the second one had so much more learning. And as I looked at the second one, I thought, well, that's what we see with SRSD, because we see the kids learning to use those transitional words and use the links and conjunctions to set up the writing. And what that's making possible is deeper learning, but I don't think it's impacting perspective taking. I think it was there in both. I'm sorry if I'm not giving you a helpful answer.
I'm wondering about, I hear this quite frequently, context reduced writing, right? So that the community is learning before they're doing the writing. And there's that peer mediated discussion long before the writing. So there's deep perspectives that they get access to before they have to write. So the writing reflects an opportunity for them to consolidate some of the other perspectives they've had an opportunity to participate in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And they've had the opportunity to build those connections and practice those connections. Yeah, and Julie just pointed out helping them to build that vocabulary, discuss that background knowledge to share together. I also love that Amy talked about reading out loud to hear where the structure is, to do that monitoring and where there might be gaps in what's there in the cohesion. Those are all really interesting, good ideas, pulling together all of those pieces that we know work. That is awesome. All right, so thinking about how this then relates to reading, I'm pulling up, Young-Suk Kim also created researched and collected data on a whole bunch of kids in both grades 2 and 4. and looked at a variety of variables and how they interacted with each other. So with a lot of our reading models, if we think about like the simple view of reading, for example, it's the two components of reading interacting with each other in a multiplicative way, having a direct impact on outcomes, reading comprehension. And so she thought, well, let's think about this hierarchical, could there be a hierarchical relationship between some of the variables in reading? And so she found a well-fitting model using these cognitive abilities of inferencing, perspective taking, and monitoring. And it was fascinating seeing this very familiar model now compared to the direct and indirect effects of writing model. And so she found good empirical evidence for this fit, where while we're reading comprehension is our vocabulary and grammar, our comprehension of vocabulary and sentences is mediated by our inferencing ability, our perspective taking ability, and our monitoring ability. So finding that same relationship in a model like this. So I thought that was really interesting and helpful. So the last thing that I got really excited about with this particular topic is thinking about how are we capturing inferencing in particular. And this path led me to a similar path that I've been taking anyway in trying to assess students' writing. And what we see over and over again in the cognitive research on reading is that inferencing is directly related to how cohesive the text is that we're reading. And so when a text has some good linking words in there, when it has good what's called sentence overlap, meaning that they're referring to things that were written in previous sentences, that it helps us understand the text a lot better. But they also find, interestingly, in this research, that when the overlap is too high and there's no inference needed, that people tend to disengage a little bit and they don't have to make inferences. And so therefore they're not having as high of reading comprehension. So there's kind of this sweet spot for making sure that you're filling in enough gaps that people are understanding what you're reading, but also leaving a little bit of gaps there for the reader to make inferences. And so they found this really interesting curvilinear relationship with cohesion. So cohesion is this term that is this big, broad term that has this really interesting relationship with mechanistic relationship with inferencing. And so a group of people went about trying to measure cohesion in written text that we read and written text that we would then write. So I'm going to show you this measurement that they created, and it's called Coh-Metrix. Yeses, nos, how many people have heard of Coh-Metrix? It's kind of an esoteric thing out there. We've got a couple of yeses, couple of nos. Yes, of course, Julie's heard of Coh-Metrix. She's been dealing with that in our lab for a little while. Coh-Metrix is something that was come up with by Art Gracer and Danielle McNamara and their team at the University of Memphis. They started work on this quite a while ago, several decades ago, but have really picked up a lot of steam in what they're looking at. So they wanted to go about measuring cohesion within a text. And they started out by measuring 150-ish different variables to try to find what makes things cohesive. And they've been narrowing it down and looking at how it impacts reading comprehension. And then also how it impacts the ability, the quality of what we write in our written compositions. And so the things that they found are these variables here. They found that narrativity, so how much like an oral story is a text, that impacts how cohesive it is. The syntactic simplicity, so how short or long the phrases are, how familiar the clauses are, and how short or long the sentences are affects cohesion of the text. Individual words, how imageable or abstract the words are, impact cohesion. And then there's this overlap that I was trying to describe earlier of how much are ideas, major ideas, overlapping from one sentence to the next. How much are, so a lot of times this is like pronoun reference. So in the first sentence, we'll say Rebecca is doing something. And then in the second sentence, we'll say how she felt about that. So the she in that second sentence is referencing Rebecca in the previous sentence. So it's creating some overlap, but you're still having to make an inference about who she is referring to. So that's referential cohesion kind of at the sentence level. And then they find deep cohesion is also an indicator of how cohesive the whole thing is. So this would be different types of connectives, causal connectives being things like because, therefore, temporal connectives, things like after, before, during, logical connectives. These are, and then adversative connectives, also things like however, in spite of. These occur throughout the text, and they're referring to ideas that may have occurred way earlier, paragraphs earlier in the text, or maybe foreshadowing a change in how things are going to happen later in the text. So all of these pieces affect the cohesion of the text, which influences the reader's inference and reflects the person who's writing it, the inferences that they're making, because they're using these connective words, for example, for deep cohesion. So this was like a really brief sprint into a goldmine of potential things. This is something that a lot of other labs, especially Danielle McNamara's lab's doing a really nice job of seeing how this impacts reading comprehension, text readability. We're using it a little bit for seeing if it gives us any information about how students' writing development occurs. And so we're getting measures of student syntactic simplicity, we're getting measures of the concreteness of their words, their narrativity. And right now it's kind of just seeing, does this differentiate students? Does this develop across time? When does it develop? But we haven't quite yet figured out a way that will make this super duper useful for teachers in schools. And it remains kind of at this abstract level right now, but it's an area that I'm really excited about and think will be really, really interesting. So I just wanted to put that out there for you as kind of a next directions. And I think things will be kind of exciting. I see there's a quick question in the chat about, I mentioned a curvilinear relationship earlier. And what do I mean by curvilinear relationship? So I was talking about how the cohesiveness of a text, generally as a text is more cohesive, so better referential cohesion, more deep cohesion. As cohesion increases, comprehension and ease of comprehension increases. However, once you get to a certain point of really strong cohesion and the writing is making all the inferences for you, the reading comprehension actually starts to go down a little bit. So that's that curvilinear line at the highest points of cohesion. Reading comprehension tends to go down a little bit, and that's because readers need to be making inferences in order to be monitoring what they're reading and staying engaged. So I think that's kind of an interesting, somewhat non-intuitive piece. So thanks for asking that question. Yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
Thank you. So I've heard that if you repeat too many words in a piece of writing over and over, the writing becomes robotic and puts you to sleep. And I think you're explaining why, that it's just over cohered and you need that variety and maybe to make
that's
the inferences.
awesome.
But what you're saying, is that true with connective devices as well? And I'm not talking conjunctions, because you know my thing about conjunctions, but just connective devices like first, next, last. Could we be overdoing all of those cohesive devices too, to the point of bringing down inferencing, like even like since, because?
Yeah, what a great question. I love your example of how repeating the same word is that it's word variety. I wonder the exact relationship there with word variety. And some of these word level measures that Coh-Metrix measures is word variety. And that would make sense to me in instruction too, because we're often trying to help kids have more word variety, more sentence variety, right? We talk about having short sentence or simple sentences mixed with complex and compound complex sentences. And then your point about the very prescriptive first, next, last kind of writing, that a really interesting connection. Makes me wonder too. So a lot of these things that we're measuring in Coh-Metrix, I'm really excited to kind of prelude to next month. We're going to talk about vocabulary and syntax, which is probably my most favorite of the topics that we're going to talk about. And we have some papers where we've used Coh-Metrix to more precisely measure vocabulary and syntax. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that next time. And wanted to make sure we had today, though, to talk about how inferencing may mediate that relationship of vocabulary and syntax to our overall writing quality and how discourse is in written language. So we have a few minutes. I'd love to take any thoughts, questions, connections that you had today, or even about anything else. Yeah, I agree with you, Julie. Every day I think about mediation, I still go back and look it up and look for more examples and think about it again. It's one of those really tricky topics.
Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
So when we have mediators, and I'm new to this, so feel free to just correct me on whatever I don't understand yet. We have, those are found through like correlations and variance rather
Yes.
than causal empirical studies. And so how do we know which of those are malleable? Like something might be a huge correlate and might explain a lot of the variation, but it's just not malleable.
Yeah. Yeah. So you bring up two really excellent points, and I'm going to separate them out. So the first point, well, I'm going to start with the second one. So yeah, I'm with you on the malleable ones, right? Because so those cognitive factors we don't have are not as malleable as our linguistic factors, right?
Oh, wait, I gotta
And
write
so, well, but they're only not as malleable because we haven't found things that have an impact on those things, right? Our effects on inferencing aren't very good. At our first session, we talked about working memory, right? You can't directly impact working memory, but you can relieve the pressure on working memory by building other basic skills. So yeah, I'm with you. Most of the time when we have mediators, they're unobserved or hard to observe by themselves, right? So inferencing, monitoring, working memory, they're hard to observe within the writing context. And we don't have things that are very good at impacting those things, and that we know we're impacting those things because we're also not good at measuring those things. But then to the second point, the other piece of it is a correlation causation thing. So we are measuring this through it's not just correlation. So the cool thing with mediation models is that it's doing something called a path model. And so you're comparing the paths, and some people, some statisticians will make the argument that this is closer to a causal model than it is to a correlational model. Because, so for example, what Young is doing in her direct and indirect effects of reading and writing models is she's comparing different paths. So comparing having the mediator in there and not having the mediator in there, or having something called partial mediation, which is another difficult concept. And so they do make some causal statements about this that vocabulary and syntax is having a direct impact on inferencing, and then inferencing is having a direct impact on discourse level oral knowledge, oral language. And that gets into like a statistical debate. But it is closer to a causal model than a correlational model. But yeah, I get frustrated the same as you, because I'm like, well, why should we waste time and instruction on something that we haven't been able to have a big impact on? That's a whole other question, right? And that's a big challenge. Sorry, I'm going to leave you with that big challenge. Any other thoughts as we want to wrap up, Rebecca?
No, I do want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to just leave that last pregnant pause there for any last questions. And I do want to make sure that everyone knows that you're going to be with us again January 18th. And we have a very exciting event in February. We have Felderman et al. Coming to talk to us about their new meta-analysis of the effects of reading comprehension intervention on reading comprehension outcomes. So we're going to start that with a brief overview of the advantages and disadvantages for meta-analyses, and 3 of the researchers will be with us. So super exciting. So come back for that too.
Oh, that sounds super fun. Melissa Felderman?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So excited.
Yes, me too. We're super excited. And so just keep bringing friends and showing up so we can continue to move our great state of Michigan forward and the rest of our country, advocating for literacy. That's what we do here at the Reading League. And thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to end this.